Hello friends, my name is Siddharth Nirvan and I'm the author of three horror books, The Lost Fish Trial, That Never Die, and the very recent That People's Town that has been published by the Loxdale Publishing and pitched by the Bookbakers Literary Agency. That People's Town also happens to be one of India's first zombie horror book written in Indian English. The story is that there is a small town called Risingar in which there is a cancer research hospital called Lord Irwin Memorial Hospital on which an unauthorized drug trial on terminally ill cancer patients has gone horribly wrong, and these patients have turned into this ferocious breed of predators, what we commonly call as the zombies. Within no time, the entire hospital has been infected, and around 400 to 500 doctors, nurses, medical staff, and everybody has turned into these zombies. The hospital has been digitally locked so that nobody can go outside and nobody can come inside. There is a small group of survivors who have been caught in the emergency room and they are waiting to get out, but unfortunately they can't. So it is a story of these survivors, so whether they'll be able to make out in one piece or not. So That People's Town just don't happens to be, a zombie horror book or a horror book. It also is a story and it displays very beautifully these complex emotions between these people. A elderly father and a dying daughter, a father and a 10-year-old kid whose mother is no more, and a housewife who has been reunited with her ex-lover. So I hope that you'll like the book, and I'm very happy to be a part of this wonderful festival. Thank you.
Good morning and welcome back to Studio 2. We now begin Has History Been Fair to Birsa Munda with Tuheen Sinha. Tuheen Sinha is a best-selling author, screenwriter, and politician. He is acknowledged among the most prolific Indian writers with a maverick knack to experiment with new genres. He has authored 11 books now. His last release, Mission Shenzan, was a geopolitical thriller. Tuheen's magnum opus, The Legend of Birsa Munda, is set for release in December 2021. He has also written extensively on all political issues. And Rishi Suri. Rishi Suri is a senior editor covering international affairs at the Daily Millar. He has previously served as the media consultant to the Jammu and Kashmir Chief Minister and continues to work with various international organizations and political personalities across India. He played a pivotal role fighting misinformation in India's polio vaccination program with UNICEF and the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, Government of India. Rishi also serves as an advisory to Samanvay, an NGO working on high-impact projects in Northeast India. I request Mr. Suri to take the conversation.
किसी राष्ट्र का भविष्य तभी उज्जवल होता है जब वो अपने अतीत के अनुभवों और विरासत के गर्व से पल पल जुड़ा रहता है। भगवान बिरसा मुंडा ने अंग्रेजों से न केवल राजनीतिक आजादी के लिए संघर्ष किया, बल्कि आदिवासियों के सामाजिक और आर्थिक अधिकारों के लिए भी लड़ाई लड़ी। वंचितों और शोषितों के अंधेरे से भरे जीवन में सूरज की तरह चमक बिखेरी।
Thank you for that. Welcome, everyone, to what promises to be a really, really interesting discussion on the legend of Birsa Munda, this brilliant new book by Tuhin Sinha. Now, just before we start, I'll talk a little bit about Birsa Munda and who he was, for those of you, of course, who don't know, of course. And of course, Tuhin will then elaborate more and also tell me where I was wrong. So, Birsa Munda was a young freedom fighter and a very, very popular tribal leader whose spirit of activism in the late 19th century is dearly remembered. And was a strong mark of protest against the British, which were ruling India at the time. He was born and raised in the tribal belt around Bihar and Jharkhand, and his achievements are known to be even more remarkable by the fact that he did all of them before he was actually 25 years old. It's quite amazing if you think about it. In recognition of his impact on this movement, the state of Jharkhand was actually created on his birth anniversary in the year 2000. Now, born on November 15th, 1875, Birsa spent most of his childhood moving from one village to another with his parents. He belonged to the Munda tribe in the Chota Nagpur Plateau area. And his early education was at Salga under the guidance of his teacher, Jaipal Nag. And in fact, on the recommendation of his teacher, Mr. Nag, Birsa converted to Christianity in order to join the German mission school, which he quickly opted out of very, very soon. Now, the impact of Christianity, I think, was felt in some way, especially in the way he related to religion. Having gained awareness of the colonial rule at the time and the efforts of the missionaries to convert tribals to Christianity, Birsa at the time started his own faith called Birsaet. Now, soon members of the Munda and Orao community started joining this Birsaet sect, and it became a huge challenge for the British conversion activities at the time, which for them were very important. I think between 1886 to 1890 is when Birsa spent a large amount of time in the Chaibasa area, which was very close to the center of the Sardar agitation. And I think the activities of the Sardars had a very, very strong impact on the mind of young Munda. He became a very, very strong part of the anti-missionary and the anti-colonial program at the time. By the time he left Chaibasa in 1890, he was strongly entrenched in the movement against the British oppression, specifically for the tribal communities. On March 3rd, 1900, if I'm not mistaken, Birsa was arrested by the British police while he was sleeping with his tribal army at the Jamkopai forest in Chakradharpur. He died soon after on June 9th in 1900 at the young age of 25. He lived a very short life, but it had a great, great impact. He has possibly mobilized one of the largest tribal community rebellions against the British, and also forced the colonials to introduce a law to protect the land rights of the tribals even at that time. His achievements have been many, many, and have been continued to be celebrated across decades. As I said, in the year 2000, Jharkhand was formed on his birthday, and I'm actually so glad that Tuhin has actually written this book on this fascinating personality. I'm also particularly pleased to see that there are several figures like this which I consider unsung because we don't know and we don't talk enough about them. And I'm really elated that the life stories and the teachings of people like Birsa Munda are now becoming mainstream in our country. With that, I will now turn to Tuhin. And Tuhin, just to begin with, why a book on Birsa Munda? What really motivated you?
Thank you, Rishi, for agreeing to be a part of this session. And I must say, I'm very impressed with your knowledge about Birsa Munda because in even today in the northern and western and southern parts of the country, I've come across many people who are not very well versed about the life of Birsa Munda. So I'm very glad. In fact, that is the purpose of the book, to spread awareness of someone who I consider among the greatest tribal or the greatest revolutionaries that India has ever produced. So if you look at the life of Birsa Munda, in a short span of 25 years, he has lived many lives. So, the first 11 years from 1875 to 1886 were the commonplace, the mundane life of tribals of that era, who used to move around from one village to the other, Obviously, his father would work as a laborer, and wherever there was an employment opportunity, the family would accordingly relocate. Between 1886 to 1890 was the period when he had a tryst with Christianity. He had a tryst with another religion, because the Mundas were constantly, the tribals were constantly in this dilemma where they realized that the only way they could be empowered at that point of time was by embracing Christianity. But then it was also a trap, because the Christian missionaries were funded by the zamindars, who were the other tyrants of the Munda community. So while the missionaries would promise them a very utopian life where they would have their debts written off, eventually they realized that that would be a trap, because the same missionaries were funded by the zamindars, and hence the missionaries would not be able to honor the commitments and the promises they would make to the Mundas and get them on board as Christians. So this disillusionment reached its culmination around 1889, 1890, when he rebelled against one of his teachers in the Chaibasa school and came back to his village. And from being a person upon whom the entire community had pinned their hopes, because not many people would actually study in that missionary school at that point of time, suddenly he was being seen as a loser. That is when he left home again to wander for a good 4 years. He came in contact with a Vaishnavite preacher called Anand Pandey. And by the time he returned in 1894, he was to his village. He was a completely transformed man. He was somebody who could cure, because Anand Pandey was was a doctor. He could treat, he could heal patients with with the treatment of medicinal herbs. So Birsa, by the time he returned in 1894, was a completely different person. He was a spiritual healer, he was a medical healer, but more importantly, he was a social reformer. So there is a very important difference over here. In 1894, when he around the time when he started achieving this cult status, he did not have a political movement in mind. The idea was to reform the tribal society, to get them back from the clasp of Christianity. And that is where he reiterated some of those, ancient cultural practices, a set of cultural practices in what is now known as Birsaite. So that was an attempt to kind of invoke the cultural legacy of Adivasis and get them back out of the clasp of missionaries. But he subsequently realized that the Britishers, because of his growing clout, were very insecure, and around 1895 in August, they had him arrested on false charges of sedition. That is where his life transformed. When he came out of jail in 1897, after spending 2 years in jail, he realized that a peaceful movement, and that was also the time when that region in 1897 experienced its worst famine. In fact, famine was for every second year, like thousands and thousands of people would perish in droughts and famines. And the worst part is that the zamindars would actually increase the stranglehold by increasing taxes rather than supporting the tribals and the poor. So in 1898 is when he decided that the only way to overthrow the Britishers or to get rid of their atrocities is a violent revolution. He organized a private army which operated in a lot of secrecy. And finally, the revolt was unleashed on 24th December 1899 in a massive revolt spanning over 2 weeks. I think the Britishers were completely taken aback, and hats off to Birsa Munda, because the kind of secrecy and the kind of discretion which the tribals had kept in around 10 or 12 present day districts was amazing. So, like I said, there are many different layers to his life, but the bottom line is that revolution shook the might of the British Empire, not just in Jharkhand, which was then a part of Bengal presidency, but also in adjoining areas. And that is one of the reasons why Madhya Pradesh celebrates the legacy of Birsa Munda in such a big way. That is one of the reasons why Orissa has virtually embraced Birsa Munda. But one last point before I hand it over to you. I'm still researching on that, but my sense is that somewhere the private army which Subhash Chandra Bose organized 40 years later, somewhere I think the idea he derived his idea from this revolution which Birsa Munda carried out in a very limited geographical areas, but with a lot of precision 40 years ago in 1899. So while during the life of Birsa Munda, he may have had a limited geographical appeal, the beauty is that he grew upon Indians, or he grew, the impact of his revolution was only felt in the years to come. And as a historical character, he's still growing. I think a lot more research is required into the life, because with subaltern characters, historians never documented their lives while they were growing up or while they were actually planning the revolution, and they actually took notice of these subaltern heroes only after they were gone. So
that's fascinating. That's fascinating. I think I especially find it of great interest that the parallel you drew to Bose's army to Birsa Munda's rebellion. Very, very fascinating. I do hope you research more and write more about that. Tuhin, what is the one particular incident or a chapter in the book that is your favorite, which you think is like the pivot point of the book? And can you please tell us about it?
Well, it's the turning point in Chaibasa, where, like I mentioned, the Mundas were in this constant dilemma whether or not to embrace Christianity, because the Mundas who were embracing Christianity were kind of leading a slightly better life. So Birsa's father had already converted a few years before Birsa was eventually sent to this missionary school. In fact, the precondition for getting admitted in that missionary school was that the student needs to be baptized. So for 4 years, Birsa tried his best to absorb the positive qualities of the new world, of the new religion. But then eventually he realized that it was a trap. Eventually he realized that irrespective of how good the missionaries or well-intended the missionaries were seeming to be, at the core of their thought process, or at the core of their teachings, were an attempt to subjugate the tribal population. And that skirmish, that massive standoff which he has with his preacher, with the father in that missionary, obviously, with a character like Birsa Munda, who was not a part of the mainstream at that point of time, I have had to dramatize certain sequences also from the point of view of a potential future adaptation, cinematic adaptation. So I think that standoff between the missionary, the Christian father, and Birsa, after which he leaves the Christian school, the missionary school in Chaibasa, that is the turning point of the story. And I think even for a reader, that's the point, that's the sequence that would give a reader goosebumps.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think this is the time that changed everything for Birsa, perhaps. Also, Tuhin, you mentioned that, of course, it started in the Chaibasa area and with Birsa Munda and Birsa. And you mentioned it spread wide and far, even though this was a part of the Bengal presidency at that time, Madhya Pradesh, Orissa. There was no media, there was no social media as such. How do you think it spread? I mean, I would like your insight into how this movement grew, because obviously tribals don't have resources.
Well, in as much as I don't like the term, somewhere it was guerrilla warfare. Where you reach out to different villages and you kind of discreetly and secretly build up a certain team across villages. But then, like I said, Birsa's revolution was not the first of the subaltern movements that India has witnessed. In fact, when I started working on the subject, I'm glad it took me way back to 1760s and 1770s, because that is when the first tribal mutiny was reported in India. And all of these were largely reported or largely centered in the areas of present-day Jharkhand or Orissa or Chhattisgarh. But then the tribal community in India, which comprises some 9 to 10% of the population, is so widespread that by the start of the 19th century, these tribal mutinies were being simultaneously reported from across the country, be it the Northeast, be it the South, be it the West, because the West has Rajasthan has the Bhil community, Maharashtra has the Gond community, Maharashtra, Andhra, Telangana has the Gond community, the Northeast tribal communities are different. But the beauty of this entire chain of events is that simultaneously, many of these revolutions were unfolding simultaneously without each one of them being aware of what's happening in the other part of the country. Because like you mentioned, there was no means of communication. So in fact, Jharkhand had witnessed coal revolution. Coal is again a region in Chaibasa, in the Chaibasa district called Kolhan. There is a place called Kolhan. So the coal revolution gets its name from there. So Jharkhand itself has consistently witnessed revolution starting around 1820. And in fact, the repercussions of the Santhal insurrection of 1855, which unfolded maybe 100 or 150 kilometers north of where Birsa's revolution was unfolding, was also felt in that region. So as a result of that, Munda Sardars were very aggressively pursuing a revolutionist agenda since 1850. But obviously, there were times where they were suppressed by the zamindars, and they would, kind of give up, because eventually, with these Adivasi leaders or Adivasi fighters, it was very difficult for them to sustain their motivation or to sustain their conviction and passion beyond a point of time, because they would get consumed in the immediate battles of survival. So 1870s is the time when this revolution, the Sardar revolution, which was going on from 1850s and possibly even before that, was crumbling. Birsa Munda, in a way, the kind of spiritual following, the kind of spiritual cloud that he began to command post 1894, put ideas, it kind of energized the Munda Sardars once again. So they started approaching him with the idea, why don't you be our leader? Why don't you lead a revolution? And we would follow you. So, I think there was an existing network to Birsa's advantage. He kind of reignited, reworked upon it. The sentiment of revolution, the sentiment of fighting back existed from much before. He only kind of re-energized or, kind of invigorated that group. Because in every society, even today, there are some people who are always in a revolutionist mode. Now, while today, obviously, you have more rebels without causes. At that point of time, there was a genuine cause, and which connected rebels across that region. So I think Birsa had a network ready, thanks to the Sardar revolution or the Sardar agitation, which had been sporadically going on from at least 40 or 50 years prior to his arrival. He managed to re-energize and reinvigorate them and get them into action.
It's really amazing. I mean, I just the more you read about Birsa Munda, you just can't imagine that he did all of it at such a young age, before he was 25 years old. One really wonders that if he were to live longer, the kind of impact possibly he could have had.
But let me take that thought ahead. Obviously, Birsa is such a fascinating character that, every time you revisit him, even as a writer, when I revisit him, newer thoughts only grow upon me. So Birsa is, it is not as if only the tribals or only the poor lead suppressed life. I think let's take it a little beyond. Birsa is an emotion. Birsa is a thought. I think it's that nature to fight an existing system. So today you have corporate bosses who suppress suppress employees. I think in a political system, people go through a lot of suppression. I have been for close friends of mine are aware of an unexplained suppression that I have been a part of in the last few years. So I think in those depressing and despondent times, one should look at the life of Birsa Munda to gain that courage, to gain that conviction, and to gain that energy to fight back. So let Birsa not be confined to that tribal hamlet. I think each one of us has a Birsa Munda in him, which is waiting to erupt, which is waiting to fight back and to clean the system.
Fascinating. Yes, Birsa is indeed a thought and an idea more than just a person. Also, Tuhin, every time you're writing and researching about such a person and the happenings around their lives, obviously you learn a lot. So, what was your biggest learning by researching and writing this book?
Well, it's about you don't need a long life to lead multiple lives in it. So I was very fascinated by the very distinctive stages in Birsa's short lifespan of 24, 25 years. That of a social reformer, that of a spiritual healer, and eventually somebody who rose to lead one of India's biggest tribal revolutions. So I think, for somebody who was not very well educated, probably, when he left education, he was about 15 years, so probably he must have been in the standard 8 or standard 9. For a person with limited education and coming from a family which did not have a very evolved worldview, for him to lead such an evolved life where he probably led 3 or 4 different, very distinctive roles in his short span of 24 or 25 years, that's what really fascinates me about his life today. And like I said, the other part which still requires a lot of research is that during the lifespan of Birsa Munda, probably he had a very limited geographical impact. But the impact was felt in the years to come. In 1908, the Jharkhand, land tenancy, Chota Nagpur Land Tenancy Act was brought in effect to protect the land holdings of Adivasis. Now, this is something which was an after effect of Birsa's revolution. So, Father Hoffman, who turns out to be the chief and antagonist of the story, because again, that's another part of the important narrative of the story. From around 1850s, Britishers had very carefully planted German missionaries in the areas around Jharkhand and Bihar, because they were working on a dual plan. While the zamindars were financially suppressing the Adivasis, the Christian missionaries were working on a plan to culturally subjugate them. So in 1899, Birsa's primary angst was against Father Hoffman, who was leading the conversion, the conversion surge in the region. But the same Father Hoffman was a very transformed man post Birsa's death. Either he realized the impact that Birsa had created and probably feared further revolutions in the years to come, but he was instrumental in getting the Chota Nagpur Land Tenancy Act executed in 1908, which was primarily meant to protect Adivasi land holdings. Like I said, the efforts which Subhash Chandra Bose put in organizing an international private army, the only person who, on a much lesser scale, had done that to such good effect were probably Birsa Munda, and before that, the other Adivasi icons, Siddho Kano, in the years 1855. So I think Birsa's impact was felt beyond his death. I think, in fact, after his death, and that's the beauty of his story. So probably even today, and going ahead, I think I'm going to lead the story beyond the book. It's going to be an offline movement. I have already written a letter to Honorable Prime Minister requesting for Bharat Ratna to be conferred upon him, because as the first tribal freedom fighter, and when you look at tribal freedom fighters, probably there are around 70, 80 or probably more of them who are waiting to be honored or whose stories are waiting to be unraveled to the world. So Birsa Munda, in a symbolic way, is the confluence of all those tribal freedom fighters who probably contributed silently in India's freedom struggle, but who never got their due. And in fact, that's the beauty of the story. Again, that I'm just slightly going away from it. You know, while we acknowledge 1857 as the first war of independence, many of these tribal mutinies would form the precursor to the 1857 War of Independence. They were quietly building up angst, which were flowing from the tribal areas to the urban centers, or to the center of the country.
No, that's fascinating. I completely agree. We should definitely bestow the Bharat Ratna on Birsa Munda and possibly learn more about the many, many other tribal leaders that led such revolutions. Uh, it's amazing that you talk about the fact that someone like Father Hoffman was actually influenced by Birsa's life, and to change the mind of a missionary is not easy, as we all know. And it's quite amazing that he actually managed to do that. So such is the impact he had on people. Now, Tuhin, how do you think? Obviously, we've spoken about his life, his teachings, but how do you think we can learn from Birsa's life and actually implement those learnings in today's day and age? I mean, how is he relevant in today's day and age?
This is a very interesting question, because time has come a full circle for the Adivasis of the country in the last 120 years. So the same, some of those political leaders in India who claim to be fighting for Adivasi rights are now very quietly, very cleverly encouraging conversion of Adivasis into Christianity. I think this is something which the Adivasi community needs to fight tooth and nail, because this is what Birsa Munda dedicated his life to. In fact, I've written an article on this. Somebody had claimed Adivasis were never Hindus, and that's another thing that it's a larger debate which needs to be somewhere cleared along the way. So Birsaite, when you talk about Birsaite, I would still look at it as a distinctive set of cultural practices because of the habitat in which the Adivasis lived. For example, if you and I were to start living in a jungle, many of our practices would change, many of our beliefs would change, primarily because of the habitat we live in. I still don't see it as a separate religion, which the usual Andolan Jivis propagate of it, that Adivasis were never part of the Hindu community. So I think these are two things which the present Adivasi population, or in fact I would call them Vanvasi, that's a much better word. One is to fight the conversion bogie, because when you go into rural or tribal Andhra Pradesh, when you go into rural or tribal Orissa or Jharkhand, sadly, what used to happen 150 years ago continues to happen over there. People are enticed by small financial offerings to convert. Somewhere, I think somewhere this needs to be fought by the tribal community, because in fact my research, I had gone through a couple of research papers on this. The Vanvasi practices are innate Sanatan Dharma practices. In fact, Kariya Munda, the senior most tribal MP with whom I've had long conversations on this, very definitely believes that they are part of the Sanatan Dharma, and that anybody who tries to distort their cultural practices as a distinctive religious practice is actually not being economical with the truth. So I think there is an attempt that there needs to be an attempt to reawaken the society, which the Honorable Prime Minister has been doing by celebrating the Janjati, by celebrating Birsa Munda's birth anniversary as Janjati Divas. In fact, credit goes to the Prime Minister for invoking Birsa Munda in such a big way in the last 7 years. I don't remember how many Prime Ministers have spoken about Birsa Munda prior to that. And in fact, the Birsa Munda Memorial in Ranchi, which has been created by the Prime Minister, is a remarkable step in creating more awareness about Birsa Munda and dispelling many of these myths and false notions which some of the other vested political interests often spread about the Adivasi community.
Absolutely. And related question, what is the core of the message that your book conveys?
Like I said, Birsa is an emotion. Birsa is a thought process. Whether it is a personal relationship, whether it is a corporate relationship, whether it is a political setup, I don't think anybody should, be prepared to compromise on his self-dignity. It's always better to go down fighting for the things that you believe in, for the set of beliefs that you carry. So I think it is that emotion, rebel with a cause for the right reason. And if you are prepared to be a rebel for the right cause and the right reason, you shouldn't worry about the consequences. Obviously, none of us have that are so unselfish to think of it this way. But I'm sure, like Birsa Munda, if you don't get your due during your lifespan, you're going to be remembered for the things you do post that if you do the right things.
Absolutely. And Tuheen, you mentioned you obviously want to take this, the message of this book beyond just the book. The fact that you've written to the Honorable Prime Minister asking for a Bharat Ratna for Birsa Munda. How else will you take this offline and make this a movement?
So in fact, there is a very interesting plan which I have just discussed with a local NGO. Around the time that the Hindi edition of the book is out, the Hindi translation is in progress, and that should be out around February end or the start of March. I intend to travel to Birsa Munda's village along with that NGO and distribute around 50 copies to the descendants of the Munda clan. Because the sad part is that today they are living in extreme poverty, most of them. Today, the descendants of Birsa Munda are not quite aware of his contribution to India's freedom struggle or his contribution to the society. So and that is the point when hopefully, I'm still in talks with an NGO over there. That is the time when hopefully I would kind of adopt 3 or 4 families, Munda families, and try and bring about a visible transformation in their lives in the next 1 year. All that is work in progress. Insofar as Birsa Munda's thoughts are concerned, there is a slew of events that are being planned across the whole of next year. So, in fact, on 16th January, in all likelihood, Madhya Pradesh Chief Minister, Honorable Shivraj Singh Chauhan ji, will be launching the book in Bhopal. We are talking to the Honorable Governor in Maharashtra. Hopefully, he will be launching the book in Mumbai. And there will be many more events. The Delhi event, obviously, because of the UP elections, where most top leaders are, busy with the UP elections, the Delhi event will most probably happen after the UP elections, which is when we also have the Hindi book ready, sometime in mid-March. But yes, multiple things are happening. It is about time that the character of Birsa Munda reaches every household. Because like I said, I mean, even now when I speak to many people from the western, northern or the southern parts of the country, they're not very clear who Birsa Munda is. In fact, there are a couple of friends of mine in a high-end society where I stay, in Mumbai. Even they seem to be, like when I first mentioned to them a year back that I'm working on this book, they were not very sure whether it's a mythological character or a real character. So I think as long as we manage to dispel all those misconceptions and myths about Birsa Munda and make him reach every household, that purpose will be solved. And obviously the book is very suitable for cinematic adaptation. So I have been getting feelers from film producers, but like I said, that's a long journey ahead. So let's see what happens on that front.
No, that'll be excellent. In fact, I can't wait to see the movie because his life is so amazing that it would actually be it could be a blockbuster hit in that sense. I hope Akshay Kumar is watching this.
We need a much younger guy below 25.
Yeah. And what's the next book in the pipeline to it?
So, in fact, there is a series of books on lesser known subaltern heroes now. Because from a marketing point of view, until you milk it the right way. So I've just signed a book with Rupa. Hopefully that should come out around 15th August next year. And then there is a third one planned for June 2023. So there are three books which are in the pipeline. And like I said, the bigger challenge at this stage of my career or life is to convert them into offline movements, which is where an NGO which I have, the Ignited India Foundation, is going to get active. A Birsa Munda leadership conclave is something which I have in mind, because the leadership ideas which a tribal youth had produced, the dynamic leadership ideas, if they were to be extrapolated today to our defense policy, to our external affairs, and to our internal security, I'm sure the results would be something very surprising. So a Birsa Munda leadership conclave, an annual event, is something I have in mind, for which I have been talking to people. So yes, I mean, the books and the offline movements will probably go hand in hand.
So I think it's very, very important to sustain the movement. These many offline things that you spoke about sound absolutely fascinating, and I hope you manage to do them all over the country and really give. I actually won't say give their due, but it'll be our way of showing respect to heroes from the past. Thank you so much, Tuheen. That was absolutely fascinating. With that, I think we can open the floor for question and answers. Do we have any questions as of now? Okay, I guess we're still waiting for questions, but since I have been asking questions, I'll ask one more. How do you? I mean, we spoke about the fact that the way this is written, it is absolutely ready to be made a movie out, and hopefully it'll happen soon. How do you envision the book actually being taken up in terms of? Do you think it'll be a mini series, a movie? Hopefully, Netflix can pick it up and do something about it.
No, this needs to be a movie, actually, because, like I said, Tiger Shroff is the guy he looks like an Adivasi. So he's somebody who I have in mind. In fact, a producer had approached me, but, like the way things work over here, you need to put the ensemble director cast in place before the financer puts in the money. So all that is work in progress. In fact, on another note, Mission Shenzhen, my previous book, is something which probably is going to happen sooner into a series. So I'll tell you where the idea of Birsa Munda, first came to me. I mean, to be written into a book. It's when you travel the world, is when you realize that the journey inwards is the one which is the most difficult one. So, in fact, the place where I grew up, in Jamshedpur, even though Jamshedpur is an urban city, Jamshedpur is an urban city, and but there are traces. There are always a Birsa Munda Chowk or a Birsa Nagar, which would remind you of a hidden mutiny, which people weren't very sure about the details, but would always be very inquisitive to know about. So it was only in the last 7 years where the Honorable Prime Minister has tried his best to invoke the legacy of subaltern freedom fighters, that I decided to dwell deeper into the subject. And I think the place where Birsa Munda's revolution unfolded was barely 70, 80 kilometers away from where I grew up. And yet, the sheer absence of factual information about the revolt is something that was very intriguing. So, in fact, Ranchi has a Birsa Munda airport. Ranchi has a Birsa Munda Chowk. But if you ask a student studying in St. Xavier's School, Ranchi, about Birsa Munda, he would probably not be able to tell you much. So I think this is where I think we need to dwell deeper into our into some of the innate movements which have been very intrinsic or very integral to our freedom struggle, but which have never got at you. And I'm glad if this book serves that purpose. It would be one of the few distinctive achievements of my life.
No, absolutely. In fact, I think this is exactly why such books are so important and must be written. The very fact that when one tries to research for something like this on such a subject, you barely find any factual information properly documented. That I hope this book can now serve as the documentation and the seminal work, so to say, for future generations to learn about Birsa
Thank you
Munda.
so much.
Thank you so much, Tuhin. This has been absolutely fascinating. I do hope you keep writing about such heroes and we keep making movies of them as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rishi. It's always a pleasure to interact with you, and I'm glad you had delved so much into Birsa's life before the session. That's really interesting, and thank you so much for the session. It's always lovely to interact with you. Thank you, Manjari, Thank you for Manjari for having the two of us together. Pune Lit Fest is always, I have always considered Pune Lit Fest to be among the best and the most exciting ones, most writer friendly. And I wish Pune Lit Fest the very best in the years to come.
And I wholeheartedly second that. All the best, team Pune Literature Festival and Manjari. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for engaging our listeners in this insightful conversation. Our next conversation, yours truly Kuru Thakur, will begin in 15 minutes. Join us for the same at 12:45 p.m.